On a Wednesday afternoon in March, Rebecca Turner received a phone call from a detective she had never met. He asked how long she had known Melissa Grant. 7 years, Rebecca said. He asked whether she had ever had reason to question anything about Melissa's situation. Rebecca said no. He asked if she still had access to the records she had kept, the volunteer schedules, the financial records from the fundraisers, the donation logs. She said yes, she kept everything. He thanked her and said someone would be in contact within 48 hours. Rebecca put the phone down. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment. Then she walked to the whiteboard. She had kept that whiteboard for 31 months. She knew every name on it. She was about to learn that she did not know the whole story behind any of them. Rebecca Turner had kept the whiteboard for 31 months. It had started as a simple system, a list of names and dates, a way to coordinate care for a friend who was going through something difficult. Rebecca had been a teacher for 30 years and a community organizer for 20. She understood systems. She understood that sustained care, the kind that doesn't collapse after 3 weeks when the initial urgency fades, requires structure. What had begun as a two-column list had expanded over time into something considerably more elaborate. Color codes, blue for meals, green for transportation, red for pharmacy runs, orange for cleaning days. There were 47 names on the board. 47 people from Grace Community Church and the streets around it who had given something, time, money, labor, food, presents, to a woman they cared about. Rebecca looked at the board. She thought about the detective's questions, not the answers she had given, the questions themselves. Something about the sequence of them, the particular order, the things he had asked and the things he had not asked, was forming a shape in her mind that she couldn't quite see directly. She had learned in 30 years of teaching to trust that feeling, the feeling that a question was pointing somewhere you hadn't looked yet. She stood in her kitchen in the late afternoon light and looked at 47 names and thought about Melissa Grant and tried to identify what it was exactly that a detective would need records for. She couldn't get there yet, but she felt the direction of it. Rebecca had spent 31 months building something she was proud of. The detective had spent 12 minutes asking questions that were making her less certain about everything she had built it around. Stories like this one, the ones that happen quietly, inside communities, between people who trusted each other completely, are what Digital Shadows is here to tell every week. If this story is staying with you, subscribe to Digital Shadows so you never miss one. Melissa Grant had arrived at Grace Community Church 7 years before the diagnosis. She had moved to Millhaven after her divorce. A fresh start, she said, in a town where she didn't know anyone. She was 41, newly alone, visibly trying. The kind of person a community like Grace reaches toward instinctively. She did not wait to be welcomed. She showed up to services, to midweek Bible study, to the Saturday morning children's ministry where she organized craft activities with a precision that impressed everyone who watched her. She ran the food pantry rotation for 2 years. She arrived early and stayed late. Rebecca Turner noticed all of it. Rebecca said she was one of those people who made you feel like the church worked because she was in it. You didn't always know what she did. You just noticed when she wasn't there. Over 7 years, Melissa Grant built a reputation that was, by every observable measure, impeccable. Melissa had asked Rebecca if she could come over. She had not said why. She had texted Rebecca on a Monday evening, short, careful, the kind of message that carries its weight in what it doesn't say. And Rebecca had replied immediately, "Of course, come in the morning, I'll have tea ready." She had known something was wrong before Melissa arrived, not because of anything specific, because of the way the message had been worded, because of the hour it was sent, because in 7 years of knowing Melissa Grant, Rebecca had learned to read the silences between her words. Melissa arrived at 9 o'clock. She sat down at the kitchen table and placed her bag on the floor beside her chair and folded her hands in her lap and said nothing for a moment. Then she reached into the bag. She took out a letter. She set it on the table between them, not sliding it across, not handing it over, just placing it there in the space between two women who had known each other long enough to sit in silence comfortably. She did not unfold it. She did not explain it. She just looked at Rebecca and waited. Rebecca Turner had sat with people in difficult moments her entire life. 30 years in a classroom had given her more of those moments than most people encounter. The child whose parent had left, the child who was frightened of something they couldn't name, the child who needed someone to simply stay present and not look away. She had learned in all those years that there was very little you could say in the first few minutes after someone told you something terrible. She had learned that presence was more useful than words. She stayed at the table with Melissa for 2 hours that morning. They talked. They didn't talk. They drank the tea when it had gone cold without noticing. Melissa cried once, briefly, and apologized for it, and Rebecca told her not to. When Melissa left, Rebecca stood at the kitchen window and watched her walk back down the street toward home. Then she turned to the whiteboard on the wall, and she picked up a pen. Melissa Grant did not announce her illness to the congregation. She told Rebecca first, privately, carefully, and she asked Rebecca to help her figure out how to tell the others. Within 2 weeks of Melissa's disclosure, Rebecca had a system in place. The meal rota began with 8 families. Within a month, it had grown to 23. Within 6 months, it encompassed the entire active membership of the Wednesday Bible study group and extended into the neighborhood 2 streets around Melissa's house. People who had never spoken to Melissa directly began cooking for her. They did not question it. They did not need to know her well. They knew Rebecca Turner, had known her for decades, trusted her judgment implicitly. And Rebecca's organization of the response was itself a form of endorsement. The food arrived. The thank you notes came back. Handwritten, specific, warm. Melissa always remembered to mention the dish specifically. The way the soup had been exactly right. The way the casserole had lasted 3 days. She made every volunteer feel that their particular contribution had mattered. One volunteer said, "She made you feel like you were the only person who had helped her. That's a gift, really. We all wanted to help more." Not one volunteer questioned the illness because Rebecca Turner had organized the response. And Rebecca Turner trusted Melissa Grant. The meal rota was not the only system Rebecca had built. There was also the donation fund. The donation fund had been Rebecca's idea, not to make money, but to relieve pressure, the practical financial weight of medical treatment that insurance doesn't fully cover, co-payments, transportation, lost income, the 1,000 small costs that accompany serious illness and are never discussed in the initial diagnosis. Rebecca had managed charitable fundraising for the school district for 20 years. She knew how to do this. She printed flyers, she booked the community hall, she arranged for a baked goods sale and a silent auction of donated items. The first fundraiser raised $14,000 in a single evening. Melissa attended for 40 minutes. She wore a headscarf. She looked tired and brave in exactly the proportion that the room needed. She cried once briefly and apologized for it. She thanked everyone by name. She had a list she had prepared. She made each person feel seen. People gave more than they had planned to. A second fundraiser, 18 months later, raised $9,000. Between fundraising events, the donation jar at the back of the church averaged $200 to $300 per week in small contributions. In total, over 31 months, Melissa Grant received $96,000 in documented financial donations and gifts. The money paid for a car she said she needed for medical appointments. A heating system she said had failed in winter, groceries, utilities, clothing, and cash given directly and gratefully received. None of it paid for cancer treatment because there was no cancer treatment. $96,000 over 31 months, and not one of the 47 people on Rebecca's whiteboard had ever seen Melissa Grant inside a hospital. To sustain the deception for 31 months, Melissa Grant had to perform. She had to calibrate her visible deterioration against a plausible treatment timeline. She had to know when to appear worse and when to appear better. She had to produce credible explanations for every milestone, every scan, every treatment cycle, every moment of hope or setback. She was remarkably consistent. When she said chemotherapy was making her too nauseated to eat, food still arrived and was graciously acknowledged. When she said she was in remission, the community celebrated, and she accepted the celebration with appropriate, restrained joy. When she said the cancer had returned, metastatic, she said, spreading, the community gathered closer and gave more. The narrative evolved precisely when it needed to. The illness worsened exactly when financial contributions had begun to taper. The recovery arrived exactly when a celebration and the second fundraiser could be organized around it. Investigators would later describe this pattern as deliberately managed, a narrative maintained with the precision of someone who understood not just what to say, but when to say it and how much to show. Melissa Grant was not simply lying, she was producing. Carol Hayes had worked in hospital administration for 19 years. She processed patient records, coordinated insurance queries, managed the administrative infrastructure that makes a hospital function beneath the level anyone sees or thanks. She was methodical, experienced, and entirely without agenda. On a Wednesday afternoon in March, she was processing a routine insurance coordination query, a cross-referencing of patient records with a regional insurance database, when the name Melissa Grant appeared in the queue. Carol searched the oncology patient database. Nothing. She checked the spelling, searched again. Nothing. She searched regional affiliates. She checked the years individually. 3 years of alleged treatment, 3 years of alleged appointments, imaging, pharmacy records, oncologist consultations, nothing, not an incomplete record, not a partially accessible file, not a record that had been archived or transferred, nothing. Carol Hayes sat at her desk for a moment, then she picked up the phone. Rebecca Turner's first feeling was not anger. This surprised her later when she had time to examine it. She had expected anger, the specific burning kind that arrives when you discover that someone has taken something from you deliberately. She had expected that. What she felt first was something she struggled to name for several weeks afterward. The closest she could get was responsible, not guilty. She had done nothing wrong. She knew that. Paul had told her that, and she believed him, and it was true. But she had organized the response. She had recruited the 47 names on the whiteboard. She had run the fundraisers and managed the donation fund and told everyone that Melissa needed them. And everyone had believed her because she was Rebecca Turner, and Rebecca Turner did not call for help unless help was needed. She had been, without knowing it, the infrastructure of the deception, not the architect, but the infrastructure. Rebecca much later said, "I kept thinking about Dorothy Sims. She's 81. She gave $50 every month for almost 3 years. That's nearly $2,000 from a woman on a fixed income. Dorothy gave it because I asked her to. That's the part I couldn't put down. Before organizing or contributing to an informal community fundraiser for an individual's medical expenses, ask gently, privately, whether contributions can be directed through the hospital's patient assistance office or a verified medical charity. This is not unkind. It is structurally protective for everyone involved, including the person you are helping." Melissa Grant was confronted by investigators on a Thursday morning. She maintained the deception for approximately 40 minutes. She cited a clerical error. She suggested the hospital records had been misfiled. She offered to provide documentation, then said the documentation was at home, then said it had been lost during a flood in the basement. The explanations accumulated with the specific velocity of a story trying to outrun itself. The investigators showed her the forged letter, the one she had shown Rebecca 3 years earlier. They showed her evidence of the template it had been produced from. They showed her the bank records documenting $96,000 in received donations against an absence of any corresponding medical expenditure. At some point in the 40 minutes, Melissa Grant stopped talking. The room was very quiet. Pastor Whitfield, who had been asked to be present as a pastoral support, said later that he had not known what to say. He had presided over 30 years of difficult conversations, funerals, divorces, estrangements, crises of faith. He had never sat in a room where the silence meant what this silence meant. What Pastor Whitfield said to his congregation the following Sunday morning was not what anyone expected him to say. Paul had not said, "I told you so." He had thought something was wrong for 2 years, not because he had evidence, not because Melissa had done or said anything he could point to specifically, but because he had watched with the measured attention of a man who spent 40 years diagnosing problems in systems he hadn't built, and something in the system had always struck him as slightly too smooth. He had said nothing because in a community like Millhaven, in a church like Grace, an accusation without evidence was its own kind of harm. He had known that. He had made a choice, and the choice had felt right at the time, and it was still right. There had been no evidence. And it had also cost 47 people something they couldn't get back. Both of those things were true. He and Rebecca sat in the sitting room on a Thursday evening and talked for 3 hours. Paul quietly said, "I'm not saying I knew. I'm saying something felt like it was built to feel safe. And things that are built to feel safe, rather than actually being safe, have a certain quality to them. I couldn't have told you what it was. I just noticed it. Rebecca asked him why he hadn't said anything. He said he didn't know what he would have said. She said she understood. She did. The following Sunday, every pew at Grace Community Church was full. People who hadn't attended in months came. People who had moved away and heard the news through the network of a small town drove back. The building held, by Rebecca's estimate, approximately 220 people, roughly twice the usual Sunday attendance. Pastor James Whitfield stood at the front of the church he had led for 30 years and looked at his congregation for a long moment before he spoke. He did not offer explanations for Melissa Grant. He did not offer psychological analysis or theological frameworks for what had happened. He said that the congregation had been deceived. He said that the deception had worked because they were the kind of people it could work on. People who gave without requiring proof, who believed without demanding evidence, who organized their lives around the premise that when someone says they are suffering, the first response is to help. He said he was not going to tell them to stop being those people. He said he was going to suggest that they learn to protect those qualities because the qualities themselves were not the problem. The room was very quiet. Pastor Whitfield said, "What was done to this congregation was possible because of who you are. I do not want you to become less of who you are. I want you to be wiser about who you let close to it." Melissa Grant pleaded guilty 6 weeks later. The sentencing was reported in the local paper. Rebecca read it at the kitchen table. She had stopped looking at the whiteboard by then. She had erased it 3 weeks after the investigation began. She said it was the hardest thing she had done in the whole ordeal. The court would later document $96,000 in financial losses across 47 contributors. But Rebecca Turner did not think about the money in the aggregate. She thought about it the way she had always thought about the whiteboard, name by name. Dorothy Sims, $1,840 over 28 months. Fixed income, Social Security, and a small pension. She had given because Rebecca had asked. The Kowalski family, $3,200, including the silent auction item, a hand-sewn quilt that Margaret Kowalski had spent 4 months making. The children's Sunday school class had held a bake sale. They had raised $340 and presented it to Melissa in an envelope decorated with stickers. Melissa had cried. She had hugged each child individually. The children did not fully understand what had happened when Rebecca tried to explain it. She was glad of that and heartbroken by it in equal measure. Rebecca said, The quilt, that's the one I can't get past. Margaret put 4 months into that quilt. It was beautiful. It was for someone who was supposed to be dying. And Melissa kept it. It was still in her house when they searched it. Rebecca Turner still lives in Millhaven. She still attends Grace Community Church, though she says the building feels different now. Not smaller, but changed, the way a room feels different after furniture has been moved, and you can still see the marks on the floor where it stood. She still organizes things. She cannot stop organizing. 30 years of teaching and 20 years of community work do not leave a person easily. What she has changed is this. When someone in her community is in need, she still responds. She still shows up. She still brings food and makes calls and recruits volunteers and builds systems. But she has learned, or rather, she has permitted herself to know something she always knew, but had considered unkind to act on. That care can be verified without being diminished. You can call the hospital. You can ask the family. You can suggest that donations go through an established organization rather than an individual. You can ask gently and without accusation whether there is a care team she can coordinate with. These things do not make you suspicious. They make the care itself more sustainable. Melissa Grant was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to make restitution, a figure the court acknowledged she was unlikely to be able to pay in full. She did not speak at sentencing. Her attorney submitted a statement describing a person in psychological distress who had escalated a situation she initially could not control. The judge acknowledged the statement and sentenced her accordingly. Rebecca Turner did not attend the sentencing. She was at home at the kitchen table writing a letter to Dorothy Sims, not about the money, about something else entirely, about the fact that Dorothy's instinct to give, that particular quality of a person who gives without being asked, illness fraud, the fabrication of medical conditions to obtain financial or emotional benefit, is estimated by healthcare fraud investigators to occur across thousands of documented cases annually. The majority of victims are not strangers. They are communities, families, churches, workplaces, friend groups, where trust has been established over years, and the social cost of questioning is considered higher than the risk of believing. The shadow in this story is not cruelty. The shadow is the weaponization of compassion, the precise targeting of a community's most generous impulse by someone who understood that impulse completely. Some shadows are human, and the most dangerous ones are the ones that look, from the outside, exactly like love. 5 things that protect communities from illness fraud. Direct donations through hospital patient assistance offices or established medical charities rather than informal cash funds. Ask whether you can coordinate with the treating medical team rather than only with the patient. Suggest that a family member or designated advocate be the point of contact for care coordination. Be alert to narratives that evolve precisely when community engagement needs sustaining, and know that asking for verification is not unkind. It is the most responsible form of care. Compassion is not a vulnerability, but compassion extended without structure can be exploited by people who understand how it works. The protection is not to give less. It is to give through verified channels to ensure that care reaches the person it is intended for, and that the infrastructure of generosity cannot be quietly redirected. Stories like this one don't make the front page. They happen quietly, inside churches, inside communities, between people who trusted each other completely. They matter precisely because nobody is talking about them. That is why Digital Shadows exists. If this episode stayed with you, subscribe to this channel. We will be here every week with another story you need to hear. Some shadows are human. Rebecca Turner said that the hardest moment in the entire ordeal was erasing the whiteboard, not the phone call from the detective, not calling the 47 volunteers, not reading the sentencing report, the whiteboard. What do you think that says about what had really been taken from her? Tell us in the comments. We read every one.